Hello everyone. Before we get started, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. That way, YouTube knows to keep sharing more stories like this with you. Now, let's jump in. I grew up in a town that doesn't really show up on most maps. If you blink while driving down the highway, you'll miss it. Just a single exit, a rusted green sign with the town's name, and a handful of roads that loop around until they lead you right back to where you started. There's not even a gas station anymore. Just the shell of one, windows boarded, pump handles cut off, and weeds growing through the cracks of the concrete. Fewer than 500 people live there, and it feels like every one of them has known each other since birth. It's the kind of place where the same last names show up on every mailbox, every business sign, every obituary. 4 or 5 family names make up half the town, and they're all tangled up together, married into one another, divorced from one another, cousins to one another. It's impossible to untangle who's related to who. At funerals, they'll all say they're family, stand shoulder to shoulder at the graveside, wiping tears and talking about our loss. But when they start dating, suddenly those bloodlines don't matter anymore. Everyone swears their distant cousins are not related that way. The whole thing feels like one huge inbred cult. I didn't have one of those big names. My family moved there when I was 8. My dad took a job fixing trucks at the only repair shop in town, and my mom started working in the school office. We lived on the edge of town, in a small ranch house that smelled like old carpet and rain. From day one, it was clear we weren't part of the circle. People didn't say it out loud, but you could feel it. The way they'd pause mid-conversation when you walked into the diner. The way kids at school looked past you, pretending you weren't there. By high school, I'd learned that if you didn't grow up there, you were nothing. The town didn't have outsiders. It had visitors who overstayed their welcome. The cafeteria tables looked like family reunion seating, each last name grouped together like a clan. They didn't mix. Even teachers were part of it. If your last name was one of the right ones, you got away with anything. Show up late, talk through class, skip a test, it didn't matter. The teachers were either married to their parents, related somehow, or grew up in the same cliques decades ago. Everyone else, the ones like me, were just background noise. The strangest part was how much the adults acted the same way. The grown-ups never grew out of it. They still had their little popularity hierarchies just like they did in high school. Every woman between 30 and 50 seemed to be stamped from the same mold. Same shoulder-length dyed hair, same jeans from American Eagle, same pastel tops, same perfume that hung in the air like a chemical cloud. They all worked some variation of the same job too. Clerical, healthcare admin, dental front desk, insurance billing. They formed tight circles that no one could break into. My mom tried for years. She'd bake for the church, volunteer for school events, go to town hall meetings. She'd come home tight-lipped, with that look she got when she was trying not to cry. People would smile at her face, then talk about her the second she turned around. She wasn't one of them, and she never would be. My dad didn't care much about fitting in. He said everyone there was weird, that the place had a way of making people small. He'd say, "It's like the air here's been breathed too many times." He wasn't wrong. There was a kind of sameness that hung over everything. The houses all looked alike. The same paint shades, the same trimmed hedges, the same brand of mailbox. Even the dogs all seemed to be the same mix of brown and black mutts, all named Buddy or Duke. I remember one summer night when I was about 16, walking down Main Street after a shift at the grocery store. It was around 9, the sun barely gone and the street was empty. The town always felt emptier at night, like it wasn't just quiet but hollow. I passed the old movie theater, the one that hadn't shown a film since before I was born. Its cracked marquee letters still advertising a showing of Titanic. The diner was still open, light spilling onto the sidewalk. Inside were the same faces I'd seen every night for years. Groups of people who all shared a last name, laughing like nothing ever changed. I'd see the same teenagers there too, Except they weren't teenagers anymore. They'd graduated but never left. They stayed, got jobs at the auto shop, the diner, or the county office, married each other, had kids that looked like smaller copies of themselves. The cycle never stopped. It was like time didn't move the same way in that town. People just grew older, but never different. When I graduated, I left. I didn't even go far, just 2 towns over. But it felt like another world. The people there didn't look at you like you didn't belong. They didn't care who your great-grandparents were or what street you lived on. I thought I'd never go back. But life doesn't always give you what you want. 2 years ago, my dad got sick. My mom called me one night, her voice shaking. He'd had a stroke and he wasn't doing well. I packed a bag and drove home the next morning. The drive felt longer than it should have. When I crossed the county line, something in my chest tightened. Everything looked exactly the same. Same houses, same cracked road, same people walking their same dogs. It was like time had frozen. At the hospital, I saw familiar faces in the waiting room. Same last names, same gossip, same small-town smiles. My dad made it through, but he wasn't the same afterward. My mom begged me to stay a while to help out around the house. So I did. Living there again as an adult was worse than I remembered. The town had shrunk somehow, or maybe I had just outgrown it. Every day felt like walking through a loop. People would wave but never say much. The same 5 trucks parked outside the same bar every night. The same women met at the same cafe at 10 a.m., laughing too loudly about nothing. It wasn't that they were mean. It was that they were identical. After a few weeks, I started noticing little things, like how everyone seemed to know exactly where I'd been that day. I'd go for a walk by the old school track, and later someone would mention it to my mom. Saw your boy out walking. If I went to the grocery store, the cashier would ask if I found what I was looking for before I even told her what I needed. One night I sat on the porch after dark, and I swear I heard my name whispered across the street. Not loud, just enough to make me freeze. The next morning I found tire tracks on our gravel driveway that didn't belong to us. My mom said someone probably turned around there, but the driveway's a dead end. You'd have no reason to drive that far unless you knew the road. The longer I stayed, the stranger it felt. Not in a haunted way, just deeply off, like everyone was moving in sync with something I couldn't see. They'd all stop and look when a certain truck passed by, all nodding, like they'd been waiting for it. They'd whisper to each other at the diner, glancing over their shoulders, then smile when I walked in. That same practiced fake perfect smile. I remember sitting at a town council meeting one evening with my mom. It was about new zoning rules, something dull. But what struck me was how the same people ran everything. Every seat filled by those same big last names. The same families deciding what happened, who got permits, who didn't. No outsiders. The whole system was a closed loop. I started driving out of town at night just to breathe. I'd park by the old quarry, look at the stars, and think about how small the place really was. But even there, I'd sometimes see headlights on the ridge above, idling for a while before turning away. It happened too many times to be coincidence. One night, when I came home late, I found a folded piece of paper on the porch. No name, no message, just a list of names. All familiar. All those big last names. Underneath them, one line written in red pen, "You're not one of us." I showed it to my mom and she told me not to make trouble. But I couldn't shake it. I started watching more closely, noticing how the same people showed up everywhere. At the store, at church, at the post office, even when I'd take walks out past the edge of town. The more I saw, the more it felt like there was an unspoken rule keeping everything in order. Something everyone followed without needing to be told. It hit me one afternoon when I was driving back from the hardware store. There was a funeral procession coming down Main Street. A long line of cars with hazard lights flashing. Every single car had one of those big family names on the license plate frames. Every single one. It was like the whole town moved as one organism, and I was just a cell that didn't belong. I left again that night. Packed my things, hugged my mom, told her I'd visit. She didn't argue. Maybe she knew it wasn't home for me anymore. Now, years later, when I think about that town, I can still picture every face. Still see them standing together in the grocery store, at the church, at the park, smiling, nodding. pretending to be normal. But they're not normal. Not really. They're all part of something that's been looping for generations, repeating itself, keeping everyone inside it. They'll marry each other, raise each other's kids, run each other's businesses, bury each other's dead. And anyone who doesn't fit, anyone with a name they don't recognize, gets slowly pushed out until they leave or break trying to stay. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd tried harder to be accepted. If I'd forced my way in, changed my name, married one of them. But deep down, I know it wouldn't have mattered. That town doesn't take people in. It absorbs them. And once it does, you stop being yourself. You just become another last name, another link in the same long, twisted chain. I haven't gone back since. My mom still lives there, and when I visit her in the city now, I can see how relieved she looks. Like she can finally breathe somewhere else. She says the town hasn't changed, and I believe her. It never will. Some places are built to grow, others are built to trap. My town was one of the latter. I moved from just outside Philadelphia to Georgia after a messy breakup and a dead-end job that I couldn't stand another day in. It was one of those decisions you make without thinking too far ahead. Packing up everything you own, throwing it into an old car that rattles every time you hit a bump, and driving south until the air feels different. I had no plan except to start over, and when I got offered a job at a catering company that did events all over the state, I took it without hesitation. The owner sounded easygoing on the phone, and I figured catering couldn't be that different no matter where you were. But I didn't realize how far from home I'd gone until that first week. The catering facility was on the outskirts of a small town about an hour outside Atlanta, surrounded by pine trees and humid air that felt heavy enough to drink. The building itself was half warehouse, half kitchen, with the kind of industrial ovens that roared like jet engines. The people who worked there were friendly enough, though I could tell right away that I was an outsider. My accent, my clothes, the way I moved, all of it made me stick out. They smiled politely, but never said much unless they had to. Still, work was work, and I figured if I kept my head down, I'd fit in eventually. The first big event they sent me to was that Friday. The guy who was supposed to train me, Tom, told me we were catering a book club luncheon in a small town a few hours away. He said it real casually, like it was no big deal. But there was this look in his eyes when he told me. I didn't think much of it at the time. We loaded up one of the white vans early in the morning, packed with trays of food, folding tables, and stacks of china wrapped in white towels. The morning was sticky and gray, and the further we drove, the narrower the roads got. After a while, the highway turned into back roads that wound through thick trees and small clearings with old farmhouses. There were Confederate flags hanging from porches, rusted trucks in driveways, and the occasional hand-painted sign for a church revival. I'd grown up near Philly, where everything felt loud and fast and full of movement, but this place felt frozen. The air was quieter here, almost expectant, like it was waiting for something. When we finally pulled up to the house, I didn't even know if house was the right word for it. It was huge, more of a plantation-style mansion, with tall white columns and peeling paint that gave it a ghostly look. The front yard was full of overgrown shrubs and azalea bushes, and the gravel driveway crunched loudly under our tires. The whole place looked like it hadn't changed since before electricity was invented. Inside, the air smelled like lemon polish and something old. Books, maybe. Or mold hidden behind the wallpaper. The walls were lined with portraits of pale-faced men in suits and stern women in long dresses, their eyes painted in a way that made them seem alive. Tom said the group we were catering for was a book club. He didn't mention that everyone in it was at least 90 years old. There were about a dozen women, all dressed in pastel colors with pearl necklaces and hair that looked like it had been the same style since the 1950s. They smiled when they saw us, but it wasn't the kind of smile that made you feel welcome. It was more like the polite kind you give to someone who doesn't belong. We started setting up the tables in their parlor, which looked like a museum more than a living space. Everything was fragile, dusty, and arranged just so. There were old books stacked on lace tablecloths and a gramophone in the corner, though I doubted it still worked. The women talked among themselves, their voices low and slow, and I caught snippets of words that made me pause. They spoke about the good old days, about how times have changed too much, and once I could have sworn one of them said something about the war, in a tone that made it sound recent. I tried not to stare, but something about them made my skin itch. The way they looked at each other, the way they carried themselves. It was like they were part of a world that had refused to move on. Out the back window, I noticed a small wooden shack sitting at the edge of a garden. Smoke rose faintly from a chimney pipe, and two figures moved about outside. They were an older man and woman, both black, wearing clothes that looked like they belonged to a different century. The woman was kneeling by a garden bed, trimming herbs with careful hands, while the man carried firewood to the shack. I assumed they were staff, but what caught me was how they didn't look toward the house once. Not when the women called out for tea, not when the door creaked open, not even when I walked out back to get some air. The woman lifted her head slightly when I stepped onto the porch, but her eyes went right past me, like she wasn't allowed to meet mine. She turned back to her work without saying a word. When I went back inside, Tom told me quietly that the two of them lived on the property, taking care of the house and cooking meals when the club met. He said it like it was the most normal thing in the world. But something about the way he avoided looking out the window told me even he didn't think it was right. The luncheon itself went by slowly. The women laughed in soft, controlled bursts, sipping tea from porcelain cups that probably cost more than my rent. They never once spoke to the servants. Not a thank you, not a glance. It was as if the two people who actually kept that place running didn't exist. I couldn't stop thinking about it. When we finished packing up, the sun was just starting to set. The sky was orange, and the air had that damp, earthy smell that comes after a long day of heat. Tom seemed in a hurry to get going, and I didn't blame him. As we pulled out of the driveway, the house looked even older, almost swallowed by the trees that surrounded it. The roads back were dark and winding, the kind where your headlights barely reach past the next bend. There weren't many streetlights. Sometimes miles went by without a single sign of life. The radio didn't get any signal, and the only sounds were the hum of the tires and the soft rattle of trays in the back. At one point, the road dipped low between two steep hills, and I noticed a faint glow ahead, the kind that comes from open firelight. Tom slowed down without saying anything. When we came around the bend, I saw the lake. It wasn't big, maybe the size of a few football fields, but it looked wide and still, surrounded by tall cypress trees that leaned over the water like they were guarding it. The air around it seemed heavier, darker somehow. Down near the shoreline, maybe 30 people stood in a semicircle, all wearing white. Their clothes weren't modern. The men wore shirts with high collars and suspenders, and the women had long skirts that brushed the tops of their shoes. They were holding candles, their light reflecting off the water in trembling lines. At first, I thought it was some kind of historical reenactment or a church service. But then I saw what they were doing. Two men stood knee-deep in the water, holding a woman between them. She wore the same kind of white gown as the others, but it clung to her body, soaked through. One of the men lifted his arms and started speaking in a voice that didn't sound like any language I knew. It was loud but broken, almost rhythmic, and everyone on shore repeated after him in strange, jumbled tones. Then they pushed her under. She didn't resist, just disappeared beneath the surface, and the ripples spread out across the still lake. They held her down longer than I expected, too long. The chanting grew louder, rising and falling like waves. When they finally lifted her out, she gasped and sagged forward, her hair plastered to her face. They led her back to shore, where another woman wrapped her in a sheet and whispered something into her ear. I felt my stomach twist. I'd seen baptisms before, this wasn't that. The way they moved, the sounds they made, it all felt too old, too primal, like something that didn't belong in this century. Tom didn't say a word. He just stared for a moment and then put the van back in gear. As we drove off, I looked out the window, but even when we were halfway up the hill, I could still see the faint glow of their candles. The rest of the drive was silent. I couldn't shake what I'd seen. The image of that woman's face as she came out of the water kept flashing in my head. The way her mouth opened, the way she trembled. When we got back to the catering facility, the air felt cooler, lighter somehow. Tom finally said something as we were unloading the van. He told me he'd grown up in Philadelphia too. He said he'd brought me to that job on purpose to show me what the South still had hiding in its corners. I didn't respond. I didn't know what to say. That night, I lay in my apartment listening to the cicadas outside. I couldn't stop thinking about those women in the mansion and the two people who lived behind it. Unseen. I kept seeing that lake, the still water swallowing the reflection of those candles. The sound of that chanting echoed in my head, even though I couldn't remember the words. Over the next few weeks, I went to other catering jobs, weddings, fundraisers, parties, but nothing like that first one. Every time we drove past a lake or an old church, I caught myself scanning the shoreline for people in white. I never saw them again, but the thought stayed with me. Sometimes, when the nights were especially humid and still, I could swear I heard faint singing drifting through the trees. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind, just my imagination. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. And every time I thought about leaving Georgia, packing up and heading home, I'd remember Tom's face when we passed that lake, the way he looked both scared and satisfied, like he'd wanted me to understand something. I did. It wasn't about religion or history or even fear. It was about how easily people can keep living in the past when no one's looking, how quietly old beliefs can survive hidden in plain sight. And once you've seen it, once you've looked directly into that part of the world, it never really leaves you. I was 22 when I went on my first music tour. It wasn't anything big, just a handful of small venues scattered across a few states. The kind of gigs that barely covered gas and cheap food. I was new to touring life, still figuring out how to sleep sitting upright, how to live off gas station coffee, and how to keep my sanity after being in a van for hours on end. That drive from Phoenix to Austin was the first real stretch of open road I'd ever done. 18 hours straight. It's the kind of drive that burns itself into your brain. The endless road, the faded asphalt, and the miles of silence broken only by the hum of tires. We left Phoenix around sunset, thinking we'd beat some of the desert heat. The van was loaded with gear, amps, drums, guitars, tangled cords, and 3 of us took turns driving. By the time we reached El Paso, it was sometime around 3 in the morning, and that was when it started feeling like we were truly nowhere. The city lights faded behind us and the world turned into open, dark nothing. The horizon just swallowed everything. You could drive for an hour and never see another car. Once you pass El Paso, there's this stretch of highway that feels like it's carved out of a dream. It's so empty that you start questioning whether you're even going the right way. Every now and then a set of headlights appears way off in the distance, and you hold on to that small sign of life until it disappears. There's nothing to look at, just dirt, fences, the occasional cluster of dying bushes, and that dry desert wind that makes you feel like you're driving through the bottom of an oven. It was around 5 in the morning when we got off the I-10, taking the smaller route, the 230. I still don't remember exactly why we did. Maybe someone thought it'd shave off some time. Maybe it was just the GPS glitching. Either way, we left the main highway and entered a place that didn't feel real. At first, the road narrowed, lined by scrubland and broken fences. We passed a sign that said, "Welcome to Peyton." It wasn't big, just one of those signs that looks like a high school kid painted it years ago and nobody ever bothered to fix. Population numbers were faded off completely. The air felt heavy, like the world was holding its breath. When we rolled into town, there was nothing moving. Not a single person. No cars, no dogs. Just rows of small buildings with peeling paint and dim lights glowing through dirty windows. It looked like the kind of town that used to be alive, but had been slowly dying for decades. You could tell it was once proud. Storefronts with hand-painted names, a gas station with rusted pumps, an old diner with stools visible through the window. But everything had that stillness that made your stomach knot up. We slowed down, rolling through the main street. Every store was closed. The clock on the dashboard said it was around 6:30 in the morning, just about when you'd expect at least someone to be awake. But it was dead quiet. The sun was starting to rise, painting everything in that pale orange glow, but it didn't help. It made the emptiness even worse. Here and there, we saw lights still on in some of the stores. Not bright lights, more like the dim flicker of fluorescent bulbs that hadn't been replaced in years. A couple of them buzzed faintly through cracked glass windows. Dust clung to everything. I remember seeing a hardware store with a sign that said, "We fix everything," in faded red paint. The door was locked, the shelves inside empty except for a few rusted tools. Then there was that one store, what looked like an old grocery or general store. On its front window there was a big paper sign taped up, wrinkled and sun-bleached, that said, "Happy Homecoming 2005. It was written in thick blue marker, surrounded by hand-drawn balloons and stars. I remember staring at it, confused. It was 2008 at the time. 3 years had passed since that homecoming. But the sign looked like it had been there forever, like nobody had cared enough to take it down. That detail stuck in my head. The kind of small thing you can't stop thinking about later. Who was supposed to take it down? Why hadn't they? Did anyone even live there anymore? We drove through the whole town in maybe 15 minutes. No cars parked anywhere. Not a single person walking around. No sounds except the van's engine. The strangest part was how clean everything was. No trash, no broken glass, no vandalism. Just frozen silence. Like someone had pressed pause on life itself. We didn't talk much about it. None of us did. There wasn't really anything to say. It just felt wrong. Like we were trespassing on something we didn't understand. I kept looking out the window, half expecting to see someone standing on a porch or peeking through a window. But there was nothing. Just still air and dust swirling in the sunlight. Once we hit the other side of town, the emptiness followed us for another hour. The road was long and narrow. No gas stations, no signs, just desert stretching endlessly on both sides. When we finally reached a truck stop miles later, I remember feeling almost relieved to see people again. Even if it was just a tired cashier and a couple of truckers grabbing breakfast. Austin was a blur after that. Long days, shows that bled into nights, crowds, noise, beer, sweat, all of it. We stayed there for a few days before heading back. I didn't think about that strange little town again until the return trip. It was a Friday afternoon, clear skies, and the road shimmered from the heat. We were heading back the same way, taking that same route through the desert. I remember we hit that turnoff for the 2:30 around noon, and I recognized the road right away. The same fence lines, the same cracked pavement, even that same faded "Welcome to Peyton" sign. I expected the same silence, but the second we rolled into town, it was completely different. The place was alive. People everywhere. I mean everywhere. The same empty streets we had passed through before were now crowded with cars, people walking around, kids running, a line outside the diner. The gas station that had looked abandoned was now open, and I could see someone wiping down the pumps. Music was playing from somewhere down the street. It felt like we'd stepped into another version of the same town. It wasn't just a few people, it looked like a festival. There were decorations strung across the street, booths set up on sidewalks, laughter, voices, all of it. The air that had once felt dead now buzzed with life. It was jarring. The same stores that looked abandoned days earlier were open and filled with people. The grocery store, the one with the "Happy Homecoming 2005, Una still had the same sign up, but now it was surrounded by fresh posters advertising some kind of parade. The door was open and people were walking in and out. Didn't make sense. I kept looking around, waiting for something to explain it, but everything looked normal. Too normal. Like the town had never been dead at all. My stomach twisted with this weird unease. I couldn't shake the memory of those dark windows and empty streets. We didn't stop. We just drove straight through, same as before. only this time weaving through crowds of people. The closer we got to the edge of town, the more uncomfortable it felt. It wasn't just surprise, it was something else, something that sat deep in the gut, like being watched. I looked in the mirrors and saw people standing on the sidewalks, turning their heads as we drove by. I told myself it was just curiosity, but it didn't feel like that. It felt like every face was aware of us in a way that wasn't right. Once we were back on the open highway, nobody spoke for a while. The van was quiet except for the sound of the tires. The sun was bright, the sky clear, but there was this heaviness that settled over all of us. Eventually, someone laughed it off, saying we must have just come through when the town was asleep or something. But that didn't sit right with me. I'd seen plenty of small towns at dawn before. There's always someone up. And those lights, those dusty windows, that eerie quiet, none of it matched what we saw on the way back. Weeks passed. We finished that leg of the tour and kept moving east. The memory of that place faded a little, but it never really left my head. Every so often I'd think about it, try to reason it out. Maybe we passed through on a Sunday morning when everything was closed. Maybe it was some local event that made the place look dead. But deep down I didn't believe that. There was something about it that logic couldn't touch. Then 2 weeks later we were in Florida. We had another long drive ahead of us. Phoenix to Austin was nothing compared to this one. Around 2 in the morning, somewhere near Casadaga, we pulled off the main road again. I remember the air was thick, humid, that kind of damp heat that clings to your clothes. Casadaga was small too, one of those quiet little towns that's easy to miss if you blink. The GPS said we were close to Orlando, but it felt like we were in another world. It was supposed to be just a quick stop. Stretch our legs, grab a drink, maybe find somewhere to rest for an hour. But the place had that same kind of strange, heavy quiet, as Peyton did the first time we saw it. The streets were empty, the lights dim, and the air smelled faintly of something metallic. The buildings were old, wooden, narrow, with signs that looked handmade. Even the way the trees leaned over the streets made it feel like the town was closing in on us. We didn't stay long. Something about the stillness made all of us uneasy. When we finally got back in the van and pulled onto the road again, I looked back one last time. There was a single streetlight flickering at the corner, and beneath it, I thought I saw someone standing there. Just a dark shape in the glow. I blinked and it was gone. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just my tired eyes playing tricks. But I'll tell you this, ever since that trip I've paid attention to small towns. Every time we tour, every time I drive through the middle of nowhere, I find myself scanning for signs of life. And sometimes, even when there are cars and people and lights, I can't shake that memory of Peyton. Dead 1 week, alive the next. It's been years and I still can't explain it. No one I've talked to has ever heard of a place like that. I've even tried to look it up online. Nothing. No mention of any town called Peyton, Texas on that stretch of road. No photos, no map listings, nothing. It's like it never existed, but I remember it. The silence, the dust, the flickering lights. That happy homecoming 2005, sign still hanging there 3 years too late. And then, just days later, the same street filled with life, laughter, movement. Felt too real to be imagined, too vivid to be mistaken. Every now and then, when I'm driving late at night, and I see an exit sign for some small town, I hesitate. Because I keep wondering, if I take that turn, if I drive down that quiet main street, will it be dead or alive this time? Grew up in a small town in North Texas, the kind of place that's more of a long pause on the highway than a destination. You could drive through it in less than 2 minutes if you didn't catch the one stoplight at the main intersection. The sign on the edge of town says, "Welcome to Elliston, Esther 1904. But the truth is the town didn't really become anything until the railroad came through decades later. Even then it never became much. The train stopped running years ago, and now they just pass us by on a different route, one that doesn't bother to slow down. Elliston never had any old brick buildings or historic storefronts like other Texas towns. The oldest thing in town is probably the water tower, white and rust-streaked, with the name of the town painted on it in faded blue letters that peeled years ago. Our square, if you could call it that, wasn't much. 4 intersecting streets formed a rough box around a squat concrete courthouse that looked more like a storm shelter than a seat of justice. Around it stood what was left of the town's ambition: abandoned offices, dusty windows, and faded signs with names no one remembered anymore. The oil boom came here in the 1960s and left just as fast. You can still tell which towns in Texas had their moment with oil. The buildings all look the same. Big plate glass fronts, mid-century angles, and brick that's too clean and too uniform to have ever seen true age. They were built fast and with pride, when everyone believed they were part of something that would never end. Now they sit in silence, hollowed out, each one a monument to someone's failed dream. I remember walking through that square as a kid. My mom worked part-time at the post office, so after school I'd hang around downtown, waiting for her shift to end. I'd wander past the empty storefronts and look through the windows. Inside, I'd see old linoleum floors curling up at the edges, faded posters for long-dead sales, and ceiling fans with one broken blade hanging at an angle. Sometimes there'd be old chairs stacked in corners, boxes of receipts, or a dusty clock frozen at some forgotten hour. The town was quiet even then. You could hear the hum of the few cars that passed through, maybe a dog barking in the distance, and the creak of the metal signs swaying on rusty brackets. It wasn't scary, just empty in a way that made you feel small. When I got older, I started noticing more of the details people overlook. The square was like a timeline written in decay. You could see the rise and fall in the architecture. The optimism was still there, buried under layers of dust. Every door had a story behind it, and I couldn't stop thinking about what it must have felt like when this place was alive. There's a building on the north side of the square, a long, low structure with greenish-tinted windows and a wide awning out front. The sign still reads Holloway Realty, even though it hasn't been open since before I was born. You can see the ghostly outlines of the old letters that used to decorate the window. Bold white paint that once read, "Buy, sell, trade, your home is here." When the sun hits it right, you can still make out the shapes through the grime. I used to stand there and imagine the owners sweeping the sidewalk in the morning, putting a little open sign in the window, and waiting for customers who might never come. In the evenings, the square changes. The light fades and the buildings start to look darker, heavier. The street lights buzz on with a faint flicker, casting that orange glow that never seems to reach the corners of the alleys. The sound of the wind between the gaps in the buildings starts to echo, and the whole town feels like it's breathing slowly, like something sleeping just beneath the surface. I moved away after high school, like most people do. There's not much to stay for, but a few years ago, I came back to take care of my father after his stroke. He's been in the same house on the edge of town since before I was born. Coming back was strange. It was like stepping into a place frozen in time, but not in a comforting way. More like walking into a dream where everything looks familiar, but feels wrong. The square looked worse than ever. Weeds were growing through the cracks in the pavement, and the paint on the buildings had peeled away almost completely. The old diner, which used to be the only place open after 6 p.m., had shut down. The courthouse still stood there, but the flagpole was bare, and the courthouse clock had stopped working years ago. One afternoon, not long after I moved back, I decided to walk around the square again. It had been years since I'd done that. The air was hot, the kind of heavy Texas heat that sticks to you no matter how slow you move. The smell of dust and dry grass hung in the air. I walked past the old bank, now boarded up, and the pharmacy that still had its sign but no glass in the windows. I crossed over to the Holloway building and stopped there for a while. Something about that place always made me uneasy. Not scared, just uneasy. It was too intact compared to the others. Most buildings had graffiti or broken windows, but not this one. Its front door was still shut tight, glass unbroken. The curtains behind the windows were faded but still drawn. It almost looked like someone might still be in there, even though I knew no one was. I pressed my face to the glass. shading my eyes with my hands to see inside. The light was dim, but I could make out shapes. The desk, an old chair, and a filing cabinet in the corner. Dust hung in the air like smoke. It felt like looking into a memory that hadn't been disturbed in decades. When I stepped back, I noticed something strange. The door handle was shiny. Everything else around it was dull and corroded, but the handle looked recently polished. I reached out and touched it. It was warm. That didn't make sense, not with the building facing away from the sun. I stood there for a long time, trying to figure out why that detail bothered me so much. Maybe someone had tried to get inside recently. Or maybe it was nothing. Metal heats up in the Texas sun. But still, the feeling lingered. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept picturing the inside of that building, frozen in time, waiting for something. I decided I'd go back the next morning with my camera, take some photos, maybe document what was left of the old square before it all crumbled completely. The next day, I walked back around sunrise. The streets were empty and the town was still half asleep. I crossed the square and stood in front of Holloway Realty again. The air was cooler then, quiet enough that I could hear the buzz of power lines and the faint creak of the flagpole rope hitting metal. I tried the door. It didn't move, but as I pulled away, I noticed the faintest sound, something shifting inside. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to freeze me in place. I waited, but nothing else happened. Maybe it was the building settling, or maybe a bird inside. I didn't stay to find out. Over the next few weeks, I started walking the square more often. It became a sort of ritual, something to fill the long, empty afternoons after I took care of my dad. Every time I passed that building, I'd look inside. Every time it looked the same, until one day it didn't. There was a chair pulled out from the desk that hadn't been before. Just a few inches different, but enough for me to notice. I stared at it for a long time, trying to convince myself I was mistaken, but the marks in the dust on the floor were clear. It had been moved. That night, I lay in bed and thought about all those abandoned buildings, how they were filled with the remains of other people's hopes. Stores that once sold clothes, hardware, groceries, all gone. Each one a small failure that added up to the death of a whole community. The next morning, I walked the square again. I noticed other things now. New footprints in the dust, small shifts inside the old storefronts, a sign that had been knocked over that wasn't before. It was like the town was quietly rearranging itself while no one was looking. I don't believe in ghosts or anything like that, but there's something about empty places that holds a kind of pressure, like the air itself remembers what used to happen there. You can feel it if you stand still long enough, the weight of time, the echo of people's lives pressed into the walls. After a while, I stopped going downtown. The more I walked those streets, the heavier it felt. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore, it was suffocating. Every boarded window and cracked door seemed to be waiting for something that would never come. When I finally left Elliston again, I drove through the square one last time. The building stood there in the morning light, quiet and still. The courthouse clock was frozen at 4:37, same as always. The Holloway building was the last one I passed. The door was slightly open, just a sliver, as if someone had finally gone inside. I didn't stop, just kept driving, watching the square shrink in my rearview mirror until it disappeared. Even now, years later, I still think about those buildings, about the optimism it took to build them, and the slow, quiet defeat that came after. Every small town in Texas has a place like that, a hollow square full of stories that no one tells anymore. Sometimes I wonder if the people who built those places ever realized how temporary their success would be, how quickly the laughter and bright lights would fade into silence. It's not ghosts that haunt those towns. It's memory. It's hope that never made it past the first good year. And that's the scariest part, knowing that every small dream, every new beginning can end the same way. Not with a crash or a tragedy, but with nothing at all. Just the slow, steady sound of time swallowing everything whole, until there's nothing left but dust and silence. I grew up in a small town that sat quietly between long stretches of farmland and two-lane roads that seemed to go nowhere. Everyone knew everyone, and gossip traveled faster than the mail. The kind of place where you could tell who was home just by the cars parked at the diner. We had one main street, a few side roads, and a whole lot of quiet in between. There wasn't much that ever really happened. So when something did, it stuck. And I'll never forget the sight of the town drunk trying to ride a cow into town. His name was Harold. He'd been around forever. Always wore the same beat-up brown jacket, faded jeans, and a cap with the bill bent almost in half. He lived alone in a small house near the edge of town, right where the pavement ended and the dirt road started. Everyone knew him as the guy who used to drive his old Ford truck into town every night, park crooked in front of the bar, and stumble home hours later, always singing something off-key. He wasn't a bad guy, not mean or dangerous, just one of those people who never really got his life together and didn't seem to care much about it. For as long as I could remember, Harold had been the town drunk. The kind of man people talked about at the gas station or grocery store, half laughing, half shaking their heads. He'd been arrested more times than anyone could count, but he always found his way back. The sheriff usually gave him a warning, maybe a night in the cell to sober up, and sent him home in the morning. But one night he crossed the line. He drove his old Ford right through someone's front yard after leaving the bar, nearly hit a mailbox, and ended up stuck in a ditch with the engine still running. After that, they took his license away for good. For a while, it seemed like he might actually stay out of trouble. I'd see him sometimes, walking along the road with a six-pack under his arm or sitting on his porch, staring out at the fields. The bar was only a few miles from his place, but too far to walk when drunk and too close for him to give up on. I think most of us figured losing his license would finally slow him down. But that was underestimating Harold's particular kind of stubborn. About a week after he lost his license, I was driving home from work, passing through the main street like usual. It was late afternoon, sun starting to dip behind the silos, the air thick with that early summer smell of grass and warm dust. As I came up to the intersection near the grocery store, I saw something that made me blink twice. There was Harold, rolling down the side of the road on his lawnmower. He had a beer can wedged between his legs, one hand gripping the wheel, the other waving lazily at cars passing by. The mower was old and slow, sputtering like it might die any second, but he looked proud of himself, like he'd found a loophole no one else had thought of. I slowed down, watching him wobble along the shoulder, his jacket flapping behind him. People were honking, some laughing, others shaking their heads. It was the most excitement we'd had in town all month. I drove on, figuring the cops would catch up to him soon enough. Sure enough, by the time I got to my driveway, I could hear the faint sound of sirens echoing from town. Later that night, someone posted a photo online of Harold pulled over right in front of the bar, sitting on his mower, while two officers talked to him. Apparently, he'd made it almost the whole way before they stopped him. They fined him, of course, and towed the mower. The whole thing became the talk of the town. You'd think that would have been enough to embarrass him into stopping. Anyone else would have called it quits after that. But Harold wasn't like anyone else. He had that strange kind of persistence that only comes from never really having anything to lose. 2 weeks later, he managed to outdo himself in a way no one saw coming. It was a warm Saturday evening, the kind that made you want to roll the windows down and let the wind blow through. I was heading home after grabbing some dinner from the diner. The roads were quiet, just the hum of my tires on the pavement and the occasional flash of fireflies in the fields. I turned onto the road that led back into town, and that's when I saw the flashing lights up ahead. At first, I thought it was just another minor accident, or maybe a car pulled over for speeding. But as I got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. There, right in the middle of the road, was Harold again. Only this time he wasn't on a lawnmower. He was on a cow. It took me a few seconds to process what I was seeing. The cow was standing there looking completely confused, big brown eyes wide, and ears flicking at the sound of the sirens. Harold was half draped over its back, clinging to the animal's neck like he thought he could steer it. He looked even drunker than before. His hat was gone, his shirt unbuttoned, and one of his boots had slipped halfway off. One trooper was holding the cow's lead rope, trying to keep it from bolting, while another stood off to the side writing something on a notepad. I pulled over and sat there for a moment just watching. The scene was so absurd it didn't even feel real. The trooper holding the cow looked like he was trying not to laugh, but you could tell he was also frustrated. The cow let out a long, uneasy moo, its tail swishing back and forth, hooves shifting nervously on the asphalt. The other trooper glanced over at Harold, who was mumbling something incoherent, his face red and sweaty under the streetlights. He looked like a man who'd made a series of bad decisions and was too far gone to realize it. It turned out later that the cow belonged to one of the local farmers, old Mr. Jensen, who lived just outside town. Harold had apparently wandered onto his property, opened the gate, and decided the cow looked sturdy enough to carry him. How he even managed to get on the animal was anyone's guess. Jensen said he saw his gate open and followed the tracks toward town, only to find Harold already stopped by the police. I remember sitting there in my truck, engine running, watching as they tried to sort the whole thing out. The smell of manure hung in the air, mixed with the faint scent of spilled beer. The cow's sides were heaving, its nostrils flaring with every breath. You could see the reflection of the red and blue lights in its eyes, blinking in confusion. One of the officers finally led the cow off the road, while the other helped Harold down, who nearly toppled over in the process. They guided him to the back of the patrol car, slow and steady, like they'd done it 100 times before. As they drove off, the cow stood there for a moment, still tied to the fence post, tail flicking. I could hear the sound of it breathing, low and steady, before Jensen came hurrying up with a flashlight in one hand and a rope in the other. He looked exhausted, like this was the last thing he needed on a Saturday night. He led the cow back down the road, muttering under his breath. I stayed in my truck until they were gone, then finally drove home, shaking my head the whole way. The next morning, the story was everywhere. Photos, rumors, jokes, everyone had something to say. Some people laughed about it for days, others said it was sad. The bar owner said Harold was banned for life, though everyone knew he'd probably still try to show up somehow. They fined him again, maybe even charged him with trespassing, but I don't think any of it mattered to him. Harold was one of those people who lived in his own world, a little detached from the rest of us. After that, I didn't see him much. Maybe the second arrest finally did what the first one couldn't. Word was he started staying home more, keeping to himself. Some nights, driving past his place, I'd see the light on in his window and hear faint music playing, something old and scratchy, the kind of tune that sounded like it belonged to another time. The bar stayed the same, the town stayed the same, and eventually people stopped talking about it. But every now and then, when I drive that same stretch of road at sunset, I still think about it. The image is burned in my mind. The flashing lights, the cow's nervous breathing, Harold swaying on its back like he was trying to remember what balance felt like. It was funny at first, the kind of story you tell your friends when you're trying to get a laugh. But there was something sad about it too, something that lingered longer than the humor. Because underneath it all, it wasn't just a drunk man trying to get to a bar. It was a man who didn't know how to stop trying, even when everyone else had already given up on him. A man who'd lost his truck, his license, his dignity, and still thought maybe, just maybe, he could find his way back to the one place where he felt like he belonged, even if it meant riding a cow to get there. And that's the thing about small towns. Nothing ever really disappears. The stories stay echoing in the places where they happened. That road still looks the same cracked asphalt, the same fence line running alongside it. The only difference is the silence. Every time I pass by, I half expect to see him again, wobbling along on something he shouldn't be, too stubborn to let the world tell him no. But the fields stay empty now, and the only sound is the wind moving through the grass, whispering reminders of the things that once made us laugh and shake our heads in disbelief. I wasn't there when it happened, but I heard every detail from the people I worked with. It became one of those stories that got passed around the office. The kind of thing that starts with nervous laughter and ends with everyone sitting in silence, staring at the floor. There was this Indian engineer who used to work with us. His name doesn't really matter now, but he was the kind of guy everyone liked. Quiet, polite, brilliant at his job. He had been in the US for years, living a normal life, raising his kids, saving money, and planning for the day he'd go back home for good. After years of long hours and late nights, he finally decided to return to India. But before leaving, he wanted to show his family the country he'd spent so much of his life in. He bought a used SUV, loaded it up with luggage, snacks, and travel toys for the kids, and set off on a cross-country trip. The plan was simple. Drive from California to Florida, stop by a few famous landmarks, and end the trip with a week at Disney World before flying back to India. It sounded like a dream. A farewell tour of the United States before returning home. A few guys from work, mostly from the South, got excited when he mentioned his plan. They gave him lists of places to see, barbecue joints, old battlefields, quirky roadside attractions, small towns with southern charm. They wanted him to see the real America, the kind that doesn't show up in travel brochures. They meant well, but I don't think any of them thought about how a brown-skinned man with an Indian accent might be received in certain parts of the Deep South. He and his family started their journey in early spring. The weather was good, clear skies, open roads. They drove through Arizona's deserts, stopped at the Grand Canyon, then crossed into Texas. He took pictures of his kids standing beside massive cacti, ate at small diners, and sent postcards to a few of us at work. Everything seemed to be going fine. But then they reached the deeper South, somewhere around Mississippi or Alabama. No one was exactly sure where. They stopped for the night in a small town, the kind of place you only see when you miss an exit, and decide to keep driving instead of turning back. There was one motel, an old two-story place with peeling paint and buzzing neon lights. He said it was late when they checked in. The kids were tired. His wife wanted to shower and rest, and the town seemed quiet enough. He paid cash for the room, grabbed a couple of sodas from a vending machine, and went upstairs with his family. The hallway smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and cleaning chemicals. He turned the air conditioner on, pulled the curtains shut, and everyone went to bed. Sometime after midnight, they were all fast asleep, until a violent pounding at the door jolted them awake. It wasn't a polite knock. It was loud, heavy, angry. Before he could even react, the door swung open, splintering the frame. Flashlights filled the room, blinding them. Men in uniforms burst inside, shouting orders. His wife screamed. The kids started crying. He tried to get up, but someone shoved him back down onto the bed. For a few seconds, he couldn't process what was happening. All he could see were bright beams of light cutting through the darkness and shapes moving fast around him. Someone yanked open drawers. Someone else dumped their suitcases onto the floor. The kids clung to their mother, crying uncontrollably. It was chaos. Eventually he realized they were police officers, or at least they looked like it. They were demanding identification. He kept saying passports, trying to tell them where they were, pointing toward a travel bag. One of the men ripped it open, found the passports, and stared at them for a long time. Then, just as suddenly as they had arrived, the shouting stopped. No one apologized. No one explained. They simply told him something about a mistaken report, and one by one they left. The hallway filled with the fading sound of boots and radios. The family sat there in silence. The room was a mess. Clothes scattered, drawers hanging open, their belongings thrown everywhere. The kids couldn't stop crying. His wife was trembling. He didn't sleep again that night. They packed up before dawn and left the town as the sun began to rise. He said that as they drove away, he kept looking in the mirror, half expecting the flashing lights to appear again. Later, when he told his story to a few of the guys at work, they were horrified. It turned out that someone in that small town had called the authorities, reporting a group of illegal Mexicans staying at the motel. That was all it took. A simple assumption based on skin color and accents. After that night, he changed their travel plans. They avoided small towns entirely. He stuck to highways, big cities, and chain hotels. But even then, things didn't get much better. A few days later, they stopped at a Burger King somewhere in the Deep South, maybe Georgia or Alabama, to get breakfast. They had been on the road since dawn. The kids were hungry, and he figured a familiar fast food place would be safe. He walked in with his family. It was quiet inside, just a few locals having coffee. They stood at the counter waiting for someone to take their order, but no one came. 2 employees behind the counter kept glancing at them, whispering to each other. Eventually, one of them walked away into the kitchen. He waited 5 minutes, 10 minutes. No one spoke to them. A couple of people sitting near the window stared openly. His wife shifted uncomfortably, tugging at her scarf. The kids looked confused. When he tried to get the cashier's attention, the man turned his back and pretended to clean something. He realized in that slow, heavy way that makes your stomach drop that they were being ignored on purpose. Not because the staff was busy, not because of some mix-up, but because of what they looked like. They left quietly. No yelling, no confrontation. He just took his kids by the hand, walked out, and drove away. He told us later that it wasn't anger he felt. It was something colder. Something like humiliation mixed with disbelief. The rest of their trip was cautious. He stuck to bigger towns, ate at places attached to gas stations, avoided stopping after dark. What had started as a dream road trip turned into something tense and exhausting. By the time they reached Florida, he was relieved more than excited. They spent a few days at Disney World, smiling for photos, riding attractions, and pretending the earlier days hadn't happened. But even then, he said he couldn't fully relax. Every time someone looked at them a second too long, every time a security guard passed by, his heart started racing again. When the trip ended, they returned to California briefly before flying to India. He cleared out his apartment, sold the car, and came into the office one last time to say goodbye. He looked thinner, older somehow. He smiled politely, thanked everyone for their help, but his eyes looked distant, like he was already somewhere far away. Few of the guys who told him about those cool southern towns couldn't even meet his eyes. They hadn't meant to put him in danger, but they couldn't undo what had happened. After he left, his story spread through the office in bits and pieces. Some people laughed awkwardly at first, trying to dismiss it as an overreaction, but others sat quietly, realizing how real it was. I kept thinking about that image. A dark motel room at 4 a.m, doors bursting open, children screaming while their father tries to explain who they are. It's the kind of moment that never leaves a person. Months later, someone found out that he'd sent an email to one of his old friends. He said his kids still had nightmares. If they heard footsteps in a hallway at night, they'd wake up crying. His wife refused to travel again. He said he was trying to focus on work, on rebuilding their life back home. But he couldn't forget how helpless he'd felt in that room. He had always believed that people everywhere were mostly good, that ignorance could be overcome with kindness and patience. But that night, he said, something inside him broke a little. Not completely, but enough to make him see the world differently. He never came back to the US again, and honestly, I couldn't blame him. When people in the office still talk about him, they always end up saying the same thing, that he was one of the kindest people they ever met. But underneath that, there's a silence, the kind that sits heavy between words, because everyone knows that what happened to him and his family could have been avoided. It wasn't a ghost story or some strange supernatural thing, just a real nightmare. The kind that happens quietly, in small, forgotten towns in the middle of the night, when good people make terrible assumptions, and that's what makes it so much worse. We had been on location all week, shooting just outside of Dublin. The weather had been cold and wet for most of it, that heavy kind of damp that clings to your clothes and seeps through your boots no matter how many layers you have on. Everyone was tired, the kind of tired that makes people quiet, short-tempered, and hungry. When we finally wrapped for the day, the director said we'd stop somewhere for dinner and a drink before heading back to the hotel. The thought of a warm pub, a pint, and something hot to eat felt like heaven. We were about an hour outside of Dublin, when we came through this small town. It wasn't even a town, really. More like a cluster of buildings that looked older than any of us. Stone cottages, a few narrow streets, a single main road that seemed to cut right through the middle and keep going into nowhere. The kind of place that didn't seem to have much reason to exist anymore, except for the people who were born there and never left. The only place with lights on was a bar at the corner, a low, dark building with a single flickering bulb above the door and a chalkboard sign leaning against the wall. The sign said, "Bar food served all evening," in white chalk that had been smeared a little by the rain. We pulled over and got out, stretching our legs, our boots crunching on gravel. It was colder than I expected when I stepped out of the van. The air smelled faintly of smoke and wet earth, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked once, sharp and lonely. Inside it was warmer, dimly lit, the kind of pub that might have been cozy under different circumstances. Low ceilings, wooden beams darkened by years of cigarette smoke and spilled beer, a few small windows with lace curtains yellowed by age. There were maybe 40 or 50 people inside, almost all men, sitting close together around tables and at the bar, their faces turned toward one another as they talked. The sound of their voices and laughter filled the room, thick and easy. It was almost comforting at first, to step into somewhere alive after the quiet emptiness of the road. Then we stepped farther in and everything went still. It was so sudden that it didn't make sense at first. One moment the place was full of noise. The next it was as if someone had turned off the sound. Every single person in that bar stopped talking and turned to look at us. Dozens of faces all at once. No expression, no curiosity, just staring. It wasn't even hostile, not exactly. Just blank cold. Their eyes followed us as we stood there. 5 strangers who had clearly taken a wrong turn somewhere. I remember the smell of the place hitting me then. Stale beer, damp wood, and something else underneath, something faintly metallic. The kind of smell that clings to old buildings that haven't seen fresh air in too long. I could hear the floorboards creak faintly under my boots, the sound impossibly loud in that silence. I glanced at the others. The director, the sound guy, 2 of the grips. Nobody said anything, but we all had the same look. The quiet realization that we had walked into somewhere we didn't belong. Behind the bar, there was one woman. She was holding a plate of something, meat and chips, I think. Steam rose from it, curling in the dim light. Her hand didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on us like everyone else's. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. The only sound was the faint crackle of a fire at the far end of the room, and the slow drip of condensation from a glass left too close to the edge of the counter. The director stepped forward a little, trying to be polite, his voice careful and normal in a way that didn't fit the room. But before he could finish, the woman behind the bar spoke. Her voice was flat, toneless. She said they didn't sell food. That was it. No explanation, no apology. Just those words like a door being shut. We all stood there for a heartbeat too long. No one quite sure what to do. I remember looking down at the plate she was holding, the steam still rising from it, and then back up at her face. She didn't move, didn't blink. Nobody in the room did. It felt like the air had thickened, like it was harder to breathe, like something was pressing down on us, waiting. The director gave a small nod and turned toward the door, motioning for us to follow. We did, slowly, walking backward for the first few steps because it felt wrong to turn our backs to them. Nobody said a word. The only sound was the shuffle of our boots on the old wood floor. When we finally stepped out into the cold again, it felt like breaking through the surface of water after being held under too long. The air outside was sharp and clean compared to the heavy stillness inside. For a second, I thought maybe we'd imagined it. Maybe it was just one of those weird small-town moments where outsiders aren't welcome. But then I saw 3 of the men from inside follow us out. They didn't come close, just stood in the doorway, watching as we got back into the van. One of them had a cigarette, the smoke curling up into the night air, but he never lifted it to his mouth. He just held it between his fingers like a prop, like something to keep his hands busy while he stared. The driver started the van and we pulled away. Nobody spoke at first. The headlights cut through the fog that was starting to roll in from the fields. The road narrow, and lined with old stone walls that seemed to close in as we went. I kept looking out the window, half expecting to see someone standing by the roadside or walking behind us. The mirrors showed only darkness. When we finally reached the main road again, the director said we'd keep driving until we found somewhere else. We ended up at a service station about 20 minutes later that had a small cafe still open. It was brightly lit, sterile, clean. The smell of frying oil and burnt coffee was oddly comforting after what we'd just walked out of. We ordered food, cheap and greasy, and ate in silence. Nobody said much about what had happened. We just wanted to get back to the hotel. That night, lying in bed, I kept thinking about it. About how quickly that place had gone silent. About all those faces turning at once. About the woman behind the bar saying they didn't sell food while holding a steaming plate in her hands. It didn't make sense, and the more I thought about it, the less it did. I tried to tell myself it was just a weird moment, that maybe it was some local thing, that maybe we'd misunderstood something. But the image of those three men standing in the doorway, watching us leave, stuck in my head. The next morning I mentioned it to one of the local crew members, a guy who lived outside Dublin. He frowned when I told him where we'd stopped. He said he thought he knew the place I meant, but that it had been closed for years. Burned down, he said. Something about a kitchen fire that killed the owner and a few regulars. He said nobody ever rebuilt it, that it was just an empty shell now, windows boarded up. I told him that couldn't be right because we'd been inside, but he just shrugged and said maybe I was thinking of somewhere else. I didn't argue. I didn't even want to think about it anymore. But later that evening, when we drove back toward the same area for another scene, I couldn't help looking out the window as we passed through the same stretch of road. There was the corner, the old signpost, the row of houses, and where the bar had been there was nothing but a dark, empty building with boarded windows and weeds growing up the sides. The chalkboard sign was still there, half buried in the grass, the words faint but still visible through the dirt. Bar food served all evening. We didn't stop. Nobody even mentioned it. The director kept his eyes on the road and we drove on. The van was quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't need explaining. I looked back once, just before the building disappeared behind a line of trees. For a moment, I thought I saw movement near the doorway, just a flicker of something pale against the dark, but then it was gone. We never talked about that night again. None of us wanted to. We finished the shoot and went back to Dublin and life moved on. But sometimes when I'm driving through the countryside and pass through one of those small towns that seem untouched by time, I think about that place, about the faces that stopped talking the moment we walked in, about the steam rising from that plate of food that supposedly didn't exist, about the men who stood in the doorway to make sure we left. And every time I remember it, I get the same feeling I had that night when the air went still inside that bar, like we had accidentally stepped somewhere we weren't meant to be, and somehow they all knew it.